Good evening, everyone, and a very warm welcome to this evening's In Conversation with Heather Phillipson, which is part of the Henry Moore Institute's series of online talks on the theme of fabrication, running from now until July. I'm Claire O'Dowd, I'm Research Curator at the Henry Moore Institute. I'm delighted that we're joined by Heather and also by Elizabeth Nielsen from Pangea Sculptors Centre, who we've been working with in collaboration on developing this series of events. There are a few things we're trying to achieve during this series of talks and conversations. We're thinking about the practicalities of how sculpture is made. We're thinking about the relationships between artists and skilled fabricators, processes of exchange and collaboration, and looking at ways in which making sculpture has changed. So I'm going to hand over to Elizabeth now to tell us a bit more about Pangea and about some housekeeping Zoom rules for tonight.
Thank you very much, Claire. We're really pleased to have developed this season of talks with Henry Moore Institute. As Claire said, my name is Elizabeth Nielsen. I'm one of the directors of Pangea Sculptors Centre, and I'm also the director of the Zabladovich collection, which is where I first worked with Heather in the past. Pangea Sculptors Centre is a platform for supporting contemporary sculptors and fostering excellence in fabrication. It was founded in 2013 by two artists and is an artist-centred organisation. We facilitate the production of innovative new sculpture, offer fabrication, technical and commissioning service, and develop critical cultural and educational programming around contemporary sculptural practice. We hope to support practitioners and promote and enrich the wider public engagement in the sculptural art form. Now, fabrication is such an instrumental part of the ecology of sculpture, but it's often completely hidden from view. And the importance of the role it plays, the relationship between the artist, the fabricator, and the different approaches to this relationship are often completely obscured or get overlooked. So with this season of talks, we really hope to give fabrication a moment in the spotlight, and with you, our audience, and with our speakers, we want to share insights into this hidden part of exhibition making. So I'm really delighted to be speaking with Heather this evening, but before we start, the old Zoom housekeeping. So the event is being recorded. For those that need them, subtitles can be turned off or on by clicking the live transcript button in the toolbar with the CC symbol on it. If at any point your video freezes or you're having connection issues, we recommend that you restart Zoom and join with the same link again. We're going to try and weave in questions and comments as we go. Please submit them with the chat function that's at the bottom in the toolbar. And if you want us to mention your name, please type that in as well. Otherwise, we'll keep them anonymous. We imagine this event is going to be around an hour. As I said, please do type questions in as we go, not just at the end, but we will leave some time at the end as well in case there's final ones. And I think that's about it. So I'm going to hand back to Claire.
Thank you very much, Lizzie. So it's an absolute pleasure to introduce Heather Phillipson this evening. Heather studied art and design at college in Pembrokeshire, and then a degree in art and philosophy at the University of Wales Institute at Cardiff. She gained a postgrad diploma in drawing at Central St Martin's and was awarded her PhD in fine art practice at Middlesex in 2007. Although Heather's education focused on fine art, her practice also includes video, digital and audio elements, as well as sculpture and drawing. She's an accomplished musician with a range spanning from classical and jazz to jungle, house and drum and bass, including a successful stint as a DJ during the late 90s rave scene. Heather is also an award-winning poet with 5 volumes to her name, and she's shown at major art galleries and events across the world. During the last 3 years in particular, we've seen an incredible rise in the scale and ambition of Heather's work, notably in the multi-screen installation work commissioned by Art on the Underground at Gloucester Road Station in 2018, and her sculpture for the Fourth Plinth at Trafalgar Square, which is on view now until next March. And we are especially lucky that she's been able to join us tonight because Heather is currently nearing the end of the installation of the new commission for Tate's Duveen Galleries, which is going to open next Monday, May the 17th, which is incredibly exciting for all of us, probably quite stressful for Heather. So it's really brilliant that you've been able to join us tonight, Heather. Can we begin, as these things so often do, by going back in time and talking about your education and the various courses that you've studied on, including a PhD. Can you tell us a bit about the kinds of practical lessons you learned and where you learned them from?
Crikey, I've got to cast my mind back now. I mean, probably thinking about it, the most critical and formative experience was when I did my advanced GNVQ in art and design at sixth form college, which was kind of the equivalent of doing a foundation, but it was over 2 years, you know, so you did everything from like sculpture and textiles and fashion to my favorite, which was the weekly life drawing class, or bi-weekly maybe, where we just spent a whole day with a really, really good tutor doing very involved life drawing and painting, which I'm aware is something that doesn't really happen at art school that much these days. And so it feels kind of important to note for me actually what a critical part of my education that was, you know, the relationship between, of course, like looking and mark making, but also prolonged observation, you know, just having that time to stare at things and watch them evolve the longer you looked at them. So from a kind of perceptual point of view as well, how much that shifted my relationship to things in front of me at like a young age. You know, I was like 17 at the time. And I went from there on to study fashion at Central St Martin's, which I thought at the time was my main passion. But it turned out that once I started studying there, it was a very, you know, in the late 90s, which was when I was applying, it was like a very prestigious and kind of cool place to be. You know, it was like Alexander McQueen had not long graduated from there, and John Galliano was a graduate, and there was loads of really exciting stuff happening, and it felt like where I wanted to be. But actually, when I got there, I discovered that I really wasn't interested in fashion. I was, you know, I maybe was sort of peripherally, but the people I was interested in were people like Rai Kawakubo, you know, from Comme des Garçons, and people actually who really worked in used clothing in a much more sculptural form. And that's what I was sort of where I was pushing my work. I'm aware this is going to in danger of becoming a bit convoluted, but I also just wanted to add that I then decided that I wanted to study fine art, and that became pretty clear. I was living with other artists, and what they were doing seemed so much more interesting to me than the course that I was on. And I wanted to stay at Central St Martin's at that point because I was already living, you know, I had my whole situation set up. But it was the year that tuition fees were brought in. So I was in the like last cohort of students before they brought in tuition fees, and I had a government grant and there were no fees whatsoever. And Central St Martin's said, you have to drop out and reapply. And that would have meant I was in a completely different financial situation. So I then had to look around for somewhere that would accept me as a transfer student so that I didn't have to pay fees and I would still be entitled to a bursary. And Cardiff was one of those places. And what was brilliant for me was that they had this course in art and philosophy, a combined course. And I was interested in the theoretical side and thinking about concepts that might underpin my practice as well. So I went there, and then everything just kind of went from there. It was a very loose course. Like to be totally honest, it was like a course that was really finding its feet, which was very hard in some ways at the time, but also was beneficial in the sense that you could really do anything you wanted. I mean, we had literally no facilities because we weren't part of the fine art school, and we had to like go and beg to use the printmaking, the sculpture, whatever. But there was something about that, maybe being a bit of an outsider. And I've always kind of felt like that in my education in terms of like, I maybe haven't taken the most conventional route through the, you know, the kind of prestigious art schools that a lot of people seem to go through. But that has kind of worked to my advantage, I feel, because I've had to plot a pretty idiosyncratic path through it and find my own way through. And then finally, just to kind of to close that loop about how I got to where I was later on, when I was doing my PhD, and by that point I'd been using language in my work quite a lot. I'd always done a lot of sound works, and I'd done works with text all throughout my BA, and then even during the drawing course I was still using language quite a lot. And I thought, oh, maybe now's the time to do something else that would help me understand that part of my practice better, have like a more critical perspective on it, and actually have some education in that area. So I did a night class at Birkbeck, which was obviously set up for people who have other commitments, you know, so it's a very wide-ranging, quite sort of democratic institution. Again, it was free at that point. I did a 2-year course in writing and completely fell in love with poetry while I was doing my PhD, and then that fed into everything and was like the kind of a really generative moment in terms of where it enabled my practice to go.
I kind of feel like the poetry offers you a really different identity in the art world as well, and it's been something that's always brought up, that you do these two things, and I think there's always this complete amazement that someone can be successful in more than one field almost. It's like but I wanted to ask really about coming like into the practice that we know now and how that practice kind of developed, and maybe you can talk us through how you started making installation-based works, and I can share some images, people bear with me, on my screen, and we can talk a bit about that. Does that work? People see anything there?
Yeah.
You don't have to talk about this particular work, but just how you started.
Yeah. So just to pick up on what I was saying earlier about my interest in like the body and sculptural form around the body, that was something that continued throughout my BA, and I was really, you know, constantly trying to mix media and bring in language and sound and physical elements and quite often performance. And that really led me into video in a very direct way, because it felt like the one medium where I didn't have to choose. I didn't have to say, well, I'm doing, you know, I'm just doing sound, I'm just doing image, I'm doing this. Was like a medium in which I could do all of that.
Mm-hmm.
And then I think at a certain point after I'd been making video for quite a long time, I can't quite remember how it came about, but this particular work that you're showing now, I made for the Whitechapel Open in 2012. So I'd submitted a video to them, which was selected. And you know, they said, like, you're in, what do you want to do? And I felt very strongly that I didn't just want it to be a video or a projection in the gallery, that the physical relationship between the viewer and the work was a key part of the work. And actually that had been a really important part of my thinking in this particular video as well. I'd seen a film by Agnes Varda in which it was all filmed on her street. I think maybe she was pregnant at the time. And she talked about using the camera. She literally just used the cable length. You know, she had a camera that was attached to a cable at the time. And she said she just used the length of the cable to dictate how far away from her home she could go, almost like an umbilical cord. And that set out the parameters of this particular film that she made. And I was so fascinated in that idea of, it was around the time when mobile phones were coming much more kind of like a prosthesis, like an extension of the body somehow. They were always at the end of your arm. And so this video that I made was really sort of grappling with a lot of that stuff, like the relationship between the body and the screen and the distance between the body and the screen. And so it just felt crucial in so many ways that this would be, that I would determine that in the space as well. And it's interesting sort of looking at this for me now, you know, and thinking about how I was trying to, I guess, sort of control those things in that space to a certain extent, but that it wasn't just a bench in front of the screen at a certain distance, that it had to be like that you were part of the artwork, and to go back to perhaps like a poetic device, that there was a point of view, you know, that it was very much the whole thing is like a point of view shot, and that there's like a sort of first person, and that you as a viewer might be able to occupy that site. And yeah, looking at it now, I start to see lots of things that are still present in my work. So I came up with this idea of some kind of bench that would mean that you were a specific distance from the screen and you could only watch it like that, and it was a one-to-one experience, and you were like in the point of view of this video, and you were always seeing the camera from what the camera was seeing from a point of view perspective. And a lot of this was made out of bits of recycled things. So a lot of this was stuff that I just found. I mean, it doesn't have that many elements, but there were bits of used timber and then some old formica that I'd found in like a shop that was closing down. And I think that lion that's underneath I'd found in some like scrap sale, and the cushion was like some interest in textural differences. And so I think this was really the genesis of a lot of the stuff that so far up until that point had only really existed in the videos, but then started to spill out into the world.
And this work can be shown on its own as a video. In fact, it's at Tate Britain at the moment, so it'll be on display when they open again with the Duveens. But is there a hierarchy for you between the sculptural form and the video, or in terms of your process, which comes first?
I mean, it has varied from work to work. So with this work, when I made it, I wasn't thinking of it sculpturally at the point of conception, but it was when I came to think about displaying it that I really thought about that. Whereas as my practice has developed, that happens much more quickly. Like I really think about how I want to show it right at the beginning, you know. So I think it used to be that the video came first and then I would sort of make a sculpture around it. But now those things are so closely intertwined. And in fact, I would say with the Duveens, it's actually worked the other way around, partly through kind of practical necessity. So, you know, like working on a show like the Tate, they want to know what the sculptural elements are way in advance, because they all have to be signed off. Everything has to be fabricated. Whereas I can just say, there's going to be a video in it, you know, and I can say, oh, I'm going to work out what it is later. So there's an element of it, you know, that there may be like some kind of vague thought in my head, but the actual like realization of the video can happen quite late. So, but in terms of a hierarchy, I would say in these early works, definitely the video that comes with a sculpture feels like the ultimate version of it. But I was also keen to make works that could go out into the world in different ways, because I consumed the world through the internet a lot back then, and I still do. And I also wanted to make works that could be viewed online. That was really important for me, and that didn't just have to exist in a gallery, but that could be accessed in a multitude of ways.
So many things I want to ask about there, but I'm going to go back to that. We're talking about the processes of how things are made, and thinking about where you mentioned a bit about that some of those objects or some of those materials were kind of scraps and gleaned. And how do you decide the form? How do you decide what's going to be in the work? Is it possible to describe what's your process for designing these installations and for producing them? This is a sketch and a real thing, so they're often very true to the sketch.
The sketches really become the blueprints. It's where I do all my thinking. I mean, if you, at some point, hopefully you'll see when the Duveens opens, like the moment that it's realized it is like a physical rendering of something that was inside my head kind of 2 years ago or whatever, that I managed to plot out through collage. So they all start with this kind of collage system, I guess, which because it's something that I do in Photoshop, this is something that's a really important point to make, which is how I think that the interface of the computer is so important in my work, even when that's not what you see in the finished, you know, the room that you walk into. Is like a lot of it is partly determined by what I can do in Photoshop, so that the way I can use a paintbrush in Photoshop actually becomes what gets translated into the three-dimensional object, and that you know, that I'm always working within the frame of the screen, and so thinking about the way that things might explode out from the edges of the screen, that the screen enables a kind of, the frame of the screen enables a kind of pressure that then gets translated into the room. And also that because I'm working on a screen and culling stuff from all over the place, so, you know, things from images from the internet, things that I found on eBay, painted lines that I do in Photoshop, that it become that relationship between the digital world and the physical world is like absolutely crucial to how the works evolve, even though when you encounter them in the space, what you might see is seemingly kind of devoid of that, or at least you wouldn't necessarily know. But this is where I really do all of my thinking.
Heather, in terms of the digital and the rendering and getting from the kind of collage process into the three-dimensional and the room and the installation, do you work with anybody else when you're doing that part of the process?
Yes, so you know, I think a lot of my ideas are quite not fantastical exactly. I mean, they are fantastical, but they're also like not necessarily rooted in the practical. They are to a certain extent, but I'm not an engineer, and I will have an idea and then I will just hope that it's realizable, and I won't necessarily, you know, I'll kind of have an idea that it will be realizable, but then obviously it's only through conversations with other people that the actual logistics of how that can work are figured out. So, you know, that's where a lot of the labour happens. And of course, that impacts the aesthetic of the work as well. You know, it's all the details about what's going to be visible when it's actually realised in physical form. And then the sort of micro decisions about all of those elements and how they impact, you know, so if you want to hang something or have it lean in a particular way, or if you want people to be able to inhabit it in some way, you know, all of those things that have to be taken into account in a collage are completely, you know, you can do whatever you want, but then once you translate that into the real world, of course, it's like, and every time it's different. So with the early sculptures that we looked at a moment ago, my partner, who's an architectural designer, helped me a lot with those because he has a really good understanding of the engineering side of things and technically how they might work. And so a lot of these kind of smaller scale works, I would say, like, I want to do this. And he would say, well, you might need to think about this or that, or like if somebody's going to sit on it, then it needs to be able to do X, you know. So that was like in the early stages, that was crucially important in being able to realize them. And also he gave me a lot of practical assistance as well. Whereas then as I've moved on to larger scale stuff, it really is like teams of people, and also that every time they're different. There's no blueprint. I don't have a formula for making my work. They always require different things, and much as I learn huge amounts from each one that I can then apply to the next project, inevitably there are also just every time there's things I don't know. So the accumulation of knowledge for me is vital, but I can't then necessarily apply in a direct way the next time round. It just depends, you know, what I carry over.
So there's been a big shift then in terms of how you make your work from the kind of handmade stuff that you were doing maybe 2013 to 15 and the kind of really big projects that you're working on now.
Yeah.
When was the shift towards working with fabricators?
I mean, it slightly depends how you define fabricators. I would say where the big shift came in my need to draw on like other people's skills beyond my own and Jake, my partner's, was when I did the show at Baltic. There was an image up a moment ago, which was like my first. So this one was like my first really big. That was my first solo show actually. So not just that it was big, but it was the first time I'd shown on my own. Prior to that, I'd only ever shown works in group shows, and actually, in fact, not that many. It had mainly been like videos that were part of like a show reel in a gallery, you know. So then I suddenly was in this position where I had this huge space, and I was like, well, I'm just going to embrace it. And again, you know, came up with these ideas through collages, and was working with a brilliant curator who completely embraced it. And Baltic has an amazing team, so I was really blessed that that was my first big installation, because they have a workshop and nothing was too big a job for them, really. They were just kind of like, of course, you know, inevitably there were conversations around what was practically possible, but they worked with me and everything was made on site. And after that, for a while, that became my way of working. So that was the case with a lot of galleries that I worked with, which were all public institutions, I should say, because I don't have I'm not represented by a private gallery. That I would tend to make the work with the institution, with whatever team they had, which is also, I mean, amazing, but tricky, because every time you're starting over with a new team of people, you know, and having to, you know, work out a language and communicate, and how to, especially if it's abroad, you know, and I'm trying to communicate certain things very long distance. And then it was only when I came to do the Fourth Plinth that I worked with like actual independent fabricators. But yeah, I've worked with other people, you know, since that Baltic show.
There's a question coming from our audience, which is, how do you find the people that you work with? Do you find them by word of mouth, or do you have different ways of finding people who can understand what you're trying to do?
Well, earlier, you know, when I was getting going with some of this stuff, I really just relied on the institutions. So it was just about having a conversation with them and saying, this is what I want to achieve. And then either finding, so this image that's up at the moment, for example, it's the Schön Kunsthalle in Frankfurt, and I showed them this massive sort of polystyrene foot and said, this is what I want. And then they were able to say, oh, there's an amazing company somewhere in Germany, it wasn't in Frankfurt, that can do this, you know. So that was kind of how it worked up into a point. And also when I had a commission for the Arts Council collection. They commissioned a work from scratch, and then for that, one of the curators recommended a few people to me, because it was very different, because it wasn't an institution, there was no space, there was no ready-made technical team. Mm-hmm. So we kind of had to beg and borrow spaces from people and sort of assembled a team for that. And then when I moved on to the Fourth Plinth, it was just too big, you know, I couldn't do it at that scale anymore. So that's when I started working with a fabricator who I've then worked with for the Fourth Plinth, and also for the Gloucester Road show, and now for the Duveens as well.
So you've been working with the same people for a number of
projects? For those 3 projects now, yeah, and because we've developed a good relationship, that's been really useful for me, but it is a completely different way of working.
Yeah, so do you, in terms of your practice generally, do you still make sculptures yourself? Are you still hands-on in that way?
Yeah, so it depends at what scale we're talking about. So there might be bits of the work that I can like literally do myself, you know, some of the smaller elements of it, or there can be, you know, so say with the process with the fabricator I've been working with for the Duveens, which has quite a lot of sculptures in it, that I'm working with them really closely. So we're making the sculptures together, as it were, you know, like I'm down there at the workshop and saying it needs to be like this, and can we use this, and can we, you know, this sort of trial and error process where their team is able to execute some of my things, and we're working on it in a very sort of hands-on way together. And then there's some of the other much bigger stuff that they just get on with, you know, and I just oversee it in a more technical way.
The question of making stuff involves a lot of kind of selection processes and questions of how you select mediums and materials that we've kind of touched on it a bit, but you're also quite concerned with things like sustainability, aren't you, in your work, and recycling and so on. Can you tell us a bit about how that shapes your selection of materials in your project?
I mean, I guess there's a couple of things. So in the first instance is where the materials come from in the first place. So like I sort of touched on before, a lot of the time I use things that already exist in the world. So a lot of the stuff is secondhand. And, you know, which is for many reasons very interesting to me. So there's the sustainability issue, but also the fact that they come kind of charged with a history, and sometimes you can read that or impose ideas of that onto there. They can be very sort of loaded objects. So in the show we're looking at here at Baltic, for example, you know, I can see several things in there that were pre-existing, you know, so like the huge grain store here, and the horse's head that you can't really make out, but it's on top of it, and the conveyor that's over there, and there was like a potato sorting machine, and so these things get adapted. But it also means, depending what happens later, that potentially they can go back out into the world, should I not be able to store them, which is quite often the case because of the scale at which I work. And some other things have been stored, so I haven't had to dispose of them, but I think kind of conceptually I'm more interested in impermanence than permanence anyway, you know, that's something that I'm more drawn to, which goes against a lot of sculptural sort of historic sculptural attitudes, I think, you know, and making things that are meant to last. So, you know, things like cardboard usually feature a lot in my work, and often organic substances, you know, like this earth that you see here, and the Duveen show has got lots of aggregates in it, and the Baltic show had lots of aggregates in it. So like ways of changing the texture of the room in very sort of direct ways, but in ways that can then just go back out into the world. You know, they can just exist there for a bit and then resume whatever function they were going to have.
We're about halfway through, so I think it'd be really good to start really focusing on these two huge commissions, well, 3 huge commissions that you've just done recently, but the 2 that are just kind of live at the moment. Can you talk about your difference in approach between Fourth Plinth and the Duveens, an outdoor work and an indoor work, or the difference of process that you had to go through?
They're so different. I mean, it's for one thing, it's probably worth saying that with the Fourth Plinth, I mean, there are many things I could say about the sort of process and how I approached it, but I wasn't expecting to get it, and that's like a really important thing, I think, to recognise in terms of how I treated it, because I was invited to put in a proposal, and I sort of didn't take it that seriously, as in, like, I didn't think what I proposed would be selected, because I wasn't that well known, and it's a hugely, you know, prestigious, high-profile location, and like, I hope I can say this on the record, they paid artists to put in a proposal, which I think is amazing. So there was literally nothing to lose. I thought, I'll put in a proposal, it's a paid piece of work. Didn't think I would get it. So I sort of just kind of had fun with it to a certain extent. You know, I think if they'd said to me, we selected you for the Fourth Plinth, can you come up with something? It would have been really a much more weighted decision. As it was, I came up with the idea, and then when they said, you know, like, how would it all work? Then I had to figure out how it would work and involve other people and see, like, how can this exist outside, and what structural support would it need, and things like that, which was where, first of all, Jake gave me some advice, and then I brought in the fabricators. Whereas with the Tate, you know, because it's in a more controlled environment, I mean, Tate also has plenty of issues because it's a listed building, and because the Duveens are they're much more of a public space than their other galleries, you know, because they're not invigilated in the same way, and it's a very leaky space, and it's got doors all over it. So that also has some technical issues, you know, ways of working that are made difficult in that space, or certain challenges that you have to address. But, you know, from just like a really fundamental practical point of view of how I work, the Duveens is a space in which I could use the full extent of my practice in a way, you know, and I have used like video and sculpture and sort of kinetics in Trafalgar Square, but time is such an important part of my work, and that's what I can use. Time in a way is my primary material, and that's what I can use in a space like the Duveens, which is how you pass through something and how things get revealed and when. And that is something I did on the Fourth Plinth as well, because you can move around it, and so different things get revealed at different moments. And of course there's the live feed, which adds a temporal element as well. But I feel like the Duveens is much more, you know, it feels much closer to how I work in a lot of ways generally, but which, you know, makes the Fourth Plinth like an interesting anomaly in a way, and not that, you know, not that it needs to be entirely different, but I think I've thought to myself before, if you'd only ever seen the Fourth Plinth, you wouldn't necessarily think the work in the Duveens is by the same person.
Yeah, totally. But in a really practical way then, should we, you know, you say kind of how something like this, the art in the underground, Gloucester Road station, like how does that idea form, and which elements are, and what's the process of the elements coming together? Are you working just on paper at the beginning and then with a kind of someone to realize it digitally first, or how?
Yeah, so in a space like that, again, because it was a very complicated space because of restrictions, so with this one, as usual, I worked through a process of collage, which I then presented to them and had conversations with the fabricators that I'd worked with for, you know, the initial phases of the Fourth Plinth. And from the Art on the Underground perspective, there were then a lot of technical things that had to be addressed. And I don't know how useful this is for other people to know, but there were things like, you know, how the station appears to train drivers when you go through it. So you can't have things that are close to the edge of the platform that might resemble a person that's about to step off. So we had to do things like mock up a video of, you know, had like some software genius who knows how to do things like that to translate the physical sculptural work into a video that you can then pass through as if you're coming through the station, and check it with the with TfL to see that it met all their health and safety. There's all the material restrictions. I mean, what's great about Art on the Underground is they have a very clear list of materials that you're allowed to use. So right away, there's kind of, you can't, you know, I can't be like, oh, I just want to use some cardboard. Like, absolutely not. You know, it's like, these are the materials you can use. And it's restricted and it's specific because they have such stringent fire safety regulations. So then it's like working with all of those things together, which you know is, again, you know, it sets parameters for the work and what you can realize and what's achievable, and again ends up impacting very directly the material quality of the work, because the kind of scrap things that I'd worked with up to that point just aren't possible, you know. So then the nature of the work starts to become very different, how it's realized. And the same with the Fourth Plinth, you know.
And these also must be, I mean, I don't know how much you can talk about it, but the budgets that these things must require must be very different from earlier works as well. And
yeah.
Is there a sense of the organisations and the commissioners supporting you in sticking to those budgets as well? Because it's such an important thing for an artist, is not, you know, how do you expand your work to be more ambitious and then know how to handle it financially as well? Because these are big things.
It's really, what's really hard is that I still don't know how much things are going to cost until they're, you know, because the work is always different and I'm working with different people and it's different environments. I can propose something and I've got no idea how much it's going to cost. And every space, so I would say definitely for the Duveens and for Gloucester Road, it's what's the most important thing is the labour around installing in that particular site. So, you know, like getting engineers to sign off on particular things, or like in the Duveens, the rigging. That's a huge amount of your budget gone already, just to even say, I want to have something that's suspended, or, you know, the fact that you can't drill into walls in a listed building. So then, you know, your budget immediately goes up because you can't just drill something into the wall, right? Anything that you want to have hanging then has to have rigging and all kinds of things. So I can't possibly anticipate how much things are going to cost. So all I can do at that point is put in what I want to do, and that's when the process of negotiation begins, like what's realistic within whatever budget that place has set. So then there's like a continual back and forth about what's realistic and what can be achieved, and if there are ways of working around things if the budget doesn't allow them to be exactly how you wanted them to be. So yeah, with all of these things, there's a huge process of negotiation.
And the institution will look after all those budgets then? In these cases, you don't get a full oversight of the budget. That's really interesting.
It really depends. So I've been more involved in some of them, which I don't necessarily find that comfortable. Not because I'm not interested, but because, again, because I don't necessarily know how much. I kind of need to keep my head in the work to a certain extent. And if somebody's saying, well, if you do this, it's going to cost X amount, it becomes tricky, because I can't necessarily say, well, if I do something else, it's going to be cheaper, because I don't know, you know. So it's yeah, you have to have a really good curatorial support team. I think that buffer that I've been very lucky in a lot of places I've worked that I've had people that have sort of buffered me between me and like the executive decision makers at an institution, and the curators in the middle, as tough as that job is, are there to negotiate those things on my behalf, you know, with the directors, and say this is how it needs to be, and maybe we need more money to achieve that, or, you know, that I don't have to constantly confront those things, because I think it's very difficult as an artist, that you need to be, you know, your head kind of needs to be somewhere else, not in like institutional budgetary conversations.
I'm going to stop sharing because I can't actually see the chat here, so can't see what's coming.
We're getting quite a few questions in. One question which kind of relates to what we were just discussing is about how you were introduced to institutions or chosen for particular projects. So how have these processes of actually getting through the doors to institutions worked for you? Is it through curator networks or formal application processes?
I mean, this, I'm not sure that what I'm going to say is very helpful to anybody else, but it's been predominantly luck. I mean, insofar as like, I haven't made that many applications, and don't consider myself to be particularly good at networking. It's not something that I particularly enjoy, as in, you know, I'm not sure that anybody enjoys it in those kind of terms, but I've met people casually, you know, and had interesting conversations with them, and then that's led to things. Or I've given a presentation somewhere, and then somebody's researched my work and then said, would you like to come and do something? And so it's kind of worked like that, which is not something that I've ever been able to predict or anticipate. And then, you know, I guess at a certain point, you know, my work became more widely visible, and then people who I'd never met saw it and invited me to do things, and so on, and it kind of progressed from there. But in the early days, it was very much like with Lizzie, for example, is a good point. You know, we met at a dinner for a mutual friend. His show was opening, and he said, do you want to come for a drink afterwards? And Lizzie was there, and we had a chat, and, you know, then our relationship developed from there. And in the early days, that's how all of these things began, I think. And the same with the Baltic show. So I guess I was lucky then. I suddenly had big opportunities that didn't really feel that logical relative to where I was at the time. Yeah.
You know, read some of the questions out and try and get some of the questions in, because there's a few that have come in. Someone has asked about the Gropiusbau, a simple one. Were you invited to make a proposal for that? Was that a new work specifically for that show?
Yeah, but I knew I was going to be in the show, so they invited me to be in the show, and then said, what do you want to do? And I think I could have shown something that was existing, but I wanted to make a new work, which is quite often the case, because I like I said before, I'm interested in things that are fairly temporary, and also I'm interested in the place in which I'm working, the context, and I tend to move on once I've made a work. I'm interested in what happens next, and so I quite often suggest that I'll do something new. So yeah, I was invited to make a proposal, but not kind of blind. I knew that I was going to be in the show.
And the follow-on question is about thinking about your larger installations that might not be possible to store. Do you archive instructions or specifications for fabrication, or are some things stored, or how do you handle the future of the works?
Probably not very well is the short answer. I mean, again, this is like a learning process that I'm on as well. And I have stored some of the things, very few of them where I've been really lucky, and somebody's just happened to say, oh, you can't let that, you know, like the giant polystyrene foot in Frankfurt, where there was an artist at the opening, and he said, what are you doing with it? And I said, I don't know. And he said, well, I've got a massive studio that's got space in it. Do you want to just come and store it? Do you want to just store it there for a while? And he looked after it for like 2 years before I was able to take it to the Baltic. So there's been things like that, you know, where I've just got lucky. But most of it has disappeared, and I must admit I don't have instructions for a lot of it. I guess it would be on installation photographs, But again, you know, because some of the materials I use are, or the objects that I use within my works are specific because they're things that I found secondhand, they'd be pretty hard to replace once they're gone. So there's quite a few things in Baltic, sorry, not in Baltic, in Tate, that's going to be opening on Monday that are completely irreplaceable. You know, they're really about those specific objects, and yeah, I won't be able to remake them.
That's a sense of kind of, that must be a challenge for some institutions if they're acquiring. I mean, for the Arts Council collection, I imagine that couldn't happen.
Yeah.
And that if, you know, the conversation with Tate, if an acquisition or the collection, if acquisitions come, do you just respond to that and have to just rethink the work again if it's going to be shown? How do you
I mean, I guess so. It's not something I've really had to address that much. So yeah, with the Arts Council collection, you're right. Like, there's nothing in there that couldn't be, well, at this moment in time anyway. I don't know about in 20 years' time, you know, whether you could still get the things. But at the moment that they commissioned and acquired it, all of that stuff was replaceable. It was like made from, the whole thing was that it was made from things that were sort of mass produced. Whereas, yeah, with the Tate, it really is a different matter, because I guess, yeah, if all of that stuff ceases to exist after Tate, and then in 20 years' time somebody wanted it to exist again, you know, you'd be looking for things that resembled the original but that weren't the original. So it's tricky. I don't know what the solution is, because I can't store. I mean, you see my studio here, it's small. I mean, it's much larger than any studio I've had up until now, but nevertheless, it's not a studio in which to store the scale of artworks that I've made for the Duveens, and still be able to get in the door.
In terms of sorry, I'm going to carry on, Claire, if that's right. There's a question here about how the public engaged with your work, and I think this one is specifically probably about the Fourth Plinth. How does the public engage with the sculpture? Is it meant to be viewed from a single viewpoint, or can you walk through it, sit on it, around it? I don't know. That's a question. I assumed it was about the Fourth Plinth, now I'm not sure. But how do you think about your engagement with the audience, and how do you define their passage and experience of your work?
I mean, it's always taken into account in my making process. I mean, I'm often thinking of, you know, like I said earlier, about how time is a material and how you proceed through the space. So sort of including myself within that as well as a visitor to it, you know, that there could be, again, like a certain moment at which things get revealed, or, you know, certain sounds that happen, or a particular ambience that I want to create at a certain point within the show. The use of transitions is often important within my work. So, but other than that, you know, I kind of leave it as open as I can for people to, insofar as I can, relative to the site, you know, and what I'm allowed to do there. So, for example, at Tate at the moment, of course, there are certain restrictions about how people can move through the space because we're in a pandemic. So then, you know, then stuff like that starts to feature in the work as well, to a certain extent. So it really just varies from context to context. Yeah, but you know, definitely, with nothing's ever really meant to be seen from a single perspective. It's the opposite. It's designed to be seen, or made to be seen, conceived to be seen, you know, from any which way. There's usually stuff, you know, overhead, behind you, like coming up from the floor. It's very hard, which makes it very hard to document, actually, precisely because it's not meant to be seen from a single perspective.
We've had another question about outdoor work, and thinking about the Tate Commission, and what kind of things did you have to consider when you were producing that?
For the Fourth Plinth? Yeah, I mean, of course, I think you're contractually obliged to make work that lasts for about 20 years. So, wow. Yeah, so it has to be resistant to the elements in all kinds of ways. Again, you know, to go back to sort of material decisions that to some extent are out of my hand, you know, as in, like, you have to work with materials that are going to withstand a certain amount of potential elemental battering. So that's the main thing. And of course, in that particular location, the engineering and how you make sure something stands up and isn't going to fall over onto a member of the public is very important. You know, so that's where engineers were involved and like loading tests and things like that. And interestingly, for the Fourth Plinth, again, this is not transferable, but just to give a taster of the kind of thing you're dealing with in public space, was a concern by me as well as by other people about potential harm to the pigeons because of the blades on the drone. So having something that's moving in public space, you know, and what hazards that might potentially pose. Then there's all the GDPR around having a video camera in a public space. So that was a huge process, actually, like a completely hidden, you know, but the conversations we had to have around, because GDPR came in, the new regulations came in between me being given the commission and it being realised in those couple of years. So that was a bit of a headache because nobody really knew exactly what it meant either, and how to get around it, or what kind of things you had to insure against. So, and also you have to get planning permission for work in Trafalgar Square, so it has to go through an independent process as well. So a huge amount of like stuff, again, that isn't the work that's but becomes a part of it, you know, and influences how it ends up looking.
It's interesting because there is a bit of a perception that the larger a work is and the greater the scale, the more freedom you have as an artist. But quite often the opposite is the case, isn't it? And in fact, there are infinite levels of restriction and bureaucracy that you have to attend to with these kind of.
That hasn't been my experience, but maybe it's just the crazy ways in which I work.
Can I ask you, Heather, about representation as well? Because you said earlier that you're not represented by a gallery. Can I ask you more about that? Whether it was like a deliberate decision or just circumstances?
I think there are a number of factors. You know, I think maybe early on I wasn't making work that appeared to be particularly sellable. You know, I think artists working with videos, for one thing, are never necessarily that attractive a prospect. And then the kind of work that I was making was fairly disposable and huge. So commercially, I guess it wasn't necessarily seen as being, I don't know. I can't speak for how it might have been perceived externally, but it wasn't a huge concern of mine either, because I've always really liked being completely independent and being able to say yes or no to opportunities on the basis primarily of A, whether I'm interested in the space, and B, whether I like the people, and that's it. Not really about how good it is for my career or anything else, you know, that it's really just like, is this something that excites me because I really like you, or I really like your program, or this particular space is really strange and interesting. And I've had a lot of work, and I've never had to answer to anybody. And then, you know, at a certain point, I think I felt, you know, if that relationship is going to happen, it's something that I want to take very seriously and not rush into. You know, I think it's very hard for a lot of young artists, if they get picked up at a young age, you know, that maybe that relationship isn't quite right, you know, and you don't have the knowledge about working to realize that that isn't, you know, perhaps the way things should work. And so I'm just very cautious about entering into that relationship without having, you know, already established a relationship with whoever that person might be. So I suppose what I'm saying is I'm not against it, but it's just something that would have to really add something to my practice and the way I work, and be a relationship that extends my practice and benefits it in lots of ways, I think, that I can't do on my own. And being on my own has so far worked out pretty well.
Yeah, I'll give it that.
Do you think not having a gallery has impacted on these later, like, do you think there would have been a different support structure, or are those institutions shaped to work with artists that have galleries?
Yes, there's definitely that. I mean, the Fourth Plinth, I was the first artist they'd had that didn't have representation, and that added a lot of complexity to the working process, and who handled the budget and stuff like that was really, was, I think, new for them, and it was actually brilliant that they were open to that, because I think it really changes what's possible if you're not always looking for a commercially represented artist. The Duveens, I think, slightly different. I think they had worked with artists that don't have representation before, but absolutely, again, a bit like what I was saying about, you know, I've used curators and forming friendships with curators that I work with as a kind of buffer between me and the institution. But at times when that has failed, then there isn't anybody, it's just me, and that is really hard sometimes, you know, and I'm the only one that's like, have been at some points with certain places, being the only one that feels like I'm on the side of my work, you know, and that's hard, but I've gotten through it somehow.
There's a question
building.
There's a question about the live feed from the end, and have you been watching it, and have you seen anything interesting specifically from the Kill the Bill protest? Is that thing been good to watch?
It's much better than Netflix. I haven't actually, I very occasionally look at it, but I mainly see it when people say, oh, I saw this picture of the Plinth while there was a protest going on, and then it's like an anti-mask protest or something, and I'm like, oh, you know, that wasn't really the kind of protest that I had in mind. But still, you know, it is interesting to pick up all those different kinds of things that are happening in the square. And yeah, you know, mainly that's been an evacuated space, hasn't it? And that's been interesting as well, that it's kind of reflected that back, which was not something I could have predicted. But the drone kind of just capturing an empty space around it, I think, is equally as interesting as all the protests and the things that I imagined it might be looking at.
Yeah, I must say I had a real shock when I saw that, when I logged on, and there was no one there.
Dead space.
Yeah.
Really surprising to me. I, you know, never expect that. There's another question about ecological impact, and with regards to ecological impact, do you have any experiences or tips about reducing the impact of energy-hungry screens and projectors? It's
really hard. Again, you know, in my recent work, the spaces that I've been showing work in, they have had requirements for particular kinds of screens or particular light levels that require a particular kind of projection to work in them. So of course there are ways around those things if you've got absolute freedom, but say like working in the underground, the restrictions on what kind of screens I could use were phenomenal. You know, I think there was literally one screen that I was allowed to use. I mean, as in one particular brand of screen and model of screen that would work in that environment, because it's so dirty. And so, you know, a screen that is safe from stuff getting into it. But yeah, I think, you know, a lot of them are less energy hungry than they used to be, but it's really problematic with projectors. Yeah.
But are you very specific about it, or do you flex to what the institution has? Like, how does that? Is it the similar kind of available? Or?
It depends. Sometimes I'll say, tell me what you've got and I'll work with it, which I think was kind of what I did at Baltic to a certain extent. I was like, you know, when you're on a budget, it's like, look, I'm barely underway with the work yet. If you let me know what you've got, maybe that will inform what I do. As in like the model of it, if it's a particular shape or size or, you know, depth of screen, you know, maybe that becomes a part of the work, that it has a particular aesthetic. Or, you know, in Tate, there were certain things that I, again, because it was, there were other restrictions and there were particular light levels and, you know, so there were particular strength of projection that's required or things like that. So again, you know, it's a process of negotiation and compromise a lot of the time. And this is all really interesting stuff, because I think this is what one doesn't necessarily know when you go into a space is like, actually, that wouldn't necessarily have been what the artist would have selected in a different context, you know. But necessity is the mother of invention, so sometimes you can just embrace those things, and, you know, I try as hard as I can to make them work for me.
Yeah, I think it's fascinating as someone who's kind of on the audience side of sculpture to hear about all these things that you have to think about when you're making work. And we have no idea about any of this. We just come in and see these wonderful environments and watch the films and have no idea what the budget was or what health and safety constraints you were operating.
And that's how it should be, though, right? I mean, like,
well,
that's,
yeah,
you want to like, experience it in its the form in which it exists ultimately. But of course, nobody ever knows what the tears and the sleepless nights that went into it. And even I, like, when I walk into some of my work, I think, how did it take that long? Why was it so difficult? But it is, it's like the amount of labor that it takes and hours that it takes to make stuff, and the sort of human effort. Like I said this to Lizzie when we had a chat the other day, it's my work it's my name on the door, but the amount of people that are involved in it, that I like to try and credit the people that I work with. So I do try and get their names on the door somewhere as well, but it's like, the invisible hands that are all over it, because it is a team effort.
I suppose that's kind of what we're aiming to reveal through all of these discussions. Our hour is up. This has been absolutely brilliant. I want to thank Elizabeth Nielsen for collaborating with us on this event, and all of our audience for their brilliant questions. We've had some great questions throughout the last few weeks. And finally, thank you so much, Heather Phillipson. And
thank you.
It's been brilliant to talk to you, and we wish you all the very best of luck with the final push towards
thank you
at the Duveen Galleries.
Thanks, we're nearly there. Yes, this talk has come at a good moment and is a nice distraction.
We're glad we could help. Thank you so much for joining us.
Thank you.
We hope that everyone in the audience can also join us for the next event in this series, which is on May 26th and is about new technologies. It's a roundtable discussion with Alice Channer, Zachary Eastwood-Bloom and Daniel Steedman Mangrane. But for now, thank you, Elizabeth Nielsen, and thank you, Heather Phillipson. And we can't wait to see the opened Tate Galleries and your piece in the Duveens.
Thank you.
Thank you, Heather.
Thanks, everyone. Thank you.